Dr. Sarah Thompson checked her watch for the third time as her black Mercedes pulled up to a late private aviation terminal. The early morning sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across the pristine tarmac where several private jets stood waiting. At 42 years old, she had become one of the most respected neurosurgeons on the East Coast, known for taking on complex cases that other doctors deemed impossible. Today's early flight was especially important. A young patient in Boston needed emergency surgery, and Sarah was the only specialist qualified to perform the delicate procedure. She had done this routine dozens of times before: arrive at the private terminal, show her credentials, and board the chartered jet that would take her to save another life. The car came to a stop, and her driver, Marcus, quickly stepped out to open her door. "Here you are, Dr. Thompson. Would you like me to help with your medical bag?" "No, thank you, Marcus," Sarah replied, smoothing down her navy blue pantsuit. "I've got it handled. Same time next week for my regular hospital rounds?" Marcus nodded with a warm smile. He had been her driver for the past 5 years and knew her schedule almost as well as she did. "Of course, doctor. Good luck with the surgery." Sarah grabbed her sleek leather medical bag containing essential documents and basic supplies. Her main surgical tools would be waiting for her at Boston General. The weight of responsibility sat comfortably on her shoulders. After 15 years of practice, this was simply another day at work. Walking towards the terminal entrance, she noted how quiet everything was at 6:30 a.m. Only a few other passengers were visible through the glass walls, most likely business executives heading out for early meetings. The clean lines and modern architecture of the building reflected its exclusive nature. This wasn't a regular airport terminal. Elite private aviation catered to corporate clients, medical professionals, and wealthy individuals who could afford private travel. Sarah's heels clicked against the polished floor as she entered the building. The air conditioning provided a welcome relief from the humid summer morning. She reached into her bag and pulled out her identification badge, flight documentation, and medical credentials, a routine she had performed countless times before. A young woman at the reception desk looked up and smiled. "Good morning. How can I assist you today?" "Good morning," Sarah responded, beginning to place her documents on the counter. "I'm Dr. Thompson. I have a 7 a.m. charter to Boston General. Emergency surgery case." The receptionist's fingers flew across her keyboard. "Ah, yes, Dr. Thompson. I see your flight here. If you'll just proceed to security screening, they'll get you through quickly since you're on a medical priority flight." Sarah nodded her thanks and turned toward the security checkpoint. Through the large windows beyond security, she could see her designated aircraft, a sleek Gulfstream G650 with the hospital network's logo on its tail. The sight reminded her of how far she'd come from her humble beginnings in South Carolina, where her mother had worked 2 jobs to put her through medical school. As she approached the security area, Sarah noticed a new guard she hadn't seen before. Something about his stance made her pause for a fraction of a second. The way his eyes narrowed when they landed on her. How his hand tightened on his security wand. After years of dealing with prejudice in the medical field, she had developed a sixth sense for these situations. Still, she maintained her professional demeanor. This was too important a day to let anything get in her way. The young patient in Boston, Jamie Chen, was only 16 and needed her help. Sarah had reviewed his case files the night before, a rare brain tumor that required immediate attention. His parents had specifically requested her, having heard of her groundbreaking techniques in pediatric neurosurgery. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward, documents ready in hand. The security guard's expression hardened, and she could already tell this wasn't going to be the smooth check-in she was used to. But she had faced obstacles her entire career. This would be no different. She was Dr. Sarah Thompson, and she had a life to save. Little did she know, this particular morning would turn into something much more than a routine flight to perform surgery. It would become a moment that would challenge not just her patients, but the very systems that allowed discrimination to persist in professional spaces. The security guard, James Mitchell, stood with his feet planted firmly apart, looking down at Dr. Thompson's credentials with exaggerated suspicion. He was a man in his 50s with graying hair and a face that seemed permanently set in a frown. His name badge gleamed under the bright terminal lights as he deliberately took his time examining her documents. "These could be fake," he said loudly, not even trying to hide the smirk in his voice. Several other travelers turned to look at the scene unfolding. We get all kinds trying to sneak into private flights these days. Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but years of performing complex surgeries under pressure had taught her to stay calm in difficult situations. She noticed a young businessman walk through the checkpoint next to her with barely a glance from the other security staff. "Sir," she said evenly, "those are official hospital credentials. You can call Boston General to verify. I'm expected for emergency surgery this morning." She pulled out her phone, ready to provide contact numbers. Mitchell's face hardened. "Put that phone away. No phones at security." He waved over another guard, completely ignoring the fact that other passengers were freely using their devices. "Hey, Tom, come take a look at this. This woman claims she's some kind of doctor." The second guard, younger and clearly uncomfortable, approached slowly. Sarah could see him reading her credentials, his eyes widening as he recognized her name. "Ah, Mr. Mitchell, I think this is Dr. Thompson. She's been through here before. She's quite well known." But Mitchell cut him off. "Well known? Never heard of her." He turned back to Sarah, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "So, you're telling me you're some big-shot surgeon? Flying private jets? Must be nice. Where'd you really get these credentials from?" Sarah took a deep breath, remembering the young patient waiting for her in Boston. Every minute of delay could affect the surgery schedule. She reached into her bag and pulled out additional identification, including her medical license and hospital board membership card. "Sir, I understand you're doing your job, but I have all the required documentation here. I'm a neurosurgeon heading to Boston for an emergency pediatric case. Time is crucial." Her voice remained professional, though she could feel anger building in her chest. Mitchell picked up her medical license, holding it up to the light as if he were some sort of forgery expert. "You expect me to believe this? A private jet for a doctor? Maybe you're the cleaning staff, got your hands on some fake IDs." He laughed at his own joke, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The young businessman who had passed through earlier stopped and stared, his mouth open in shock. Other passengers began whispering, some pulling out their phones to record the incident. Sarah noticed the receptionist from earlier frantically making a phone call. "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said, her voice firm but controlled, "I need to speak with your supervisor immediately. This is discrimination, and it's being recorded by several witnesses." She gestured to the growing crowd of onlookers with their phones out. Mitchell's face reddened. "Are you threatening me? I'll have security remove you from the premises. This is a private aviation terminal, not some public bus station. We have standards here." The implications of his words hung heavy in the air. Sarah stood her ground, her 5'6" frame somehow seeming to match his 6-foot stature. She had faced discrimination before, in medical school, during her residency, even as an attending surgeon, but this was different. This time, a young patient's life hung in the balance. "Call your supervisor," she repeated, her voice carrying the same authority she used in the operating room. "And while you're at it, call Boston General Hospital. Ask for Dr. Richardson, head of the board. Tell him why his lead surgeon is being detained on baseless grounds." Mitchell's hand moved to his radio, but his smirk remained. He clearly thought he had the upper hand in this situation. What he didn't know was that his whole world was about to come crashing down around him, and Dr. Sarah Thompson would be the last person he ever harassed at this terminal. The situation at a light private aviation security checkpoint had drawn quite a crowd. Dr. Sarah Thompson stood calmly while security guard Mitchell spoke into his radio, his face getting redder by the minute. The morning sun now streamed through the terminal's large windows, casting long shadows across the tense scene. "We have a situation at Checkpoint 3, Mitchell said into his radio, keeping his eyes fixed on Sarah. "Someone with suspicious credentials trying to board a private medical flight." He emphasized the word suspicious while giving Sarah a cold stare. A young woman in the crowd raised her hand. "Excuse me, but isn't that Dr. Thompson? She performed surgery on my mother last year. She's a brilliant surgeon." Others began nodding and murmuring in agreement. Mitchell's face twitched with annoyance. "Ma'am, stay out of this. This is a security matter." He turned back to Sarah. "If you're really a doctor, why aren't you flying from the main terminal like regular people?" Sarah pulled out her phone again, this time ignoring Mitchell's protests. "I'm calling Boston General right now. A 16-year-old patient is waiting for emergency surgery, and you're delaying a time-sensitive medical flight." Put that phone away. Mitchell stepped forward aggressively. This is a restricted area. One more move like that and I'm calling the police. The young security guard, Tom, tried to intervene again. Sir, I really think we should. Be quiet, Tom. Mitchell snapped. You're too new to understand. These scammers are getting clever these days. Private jet, fancy clothes, fake ideas, we've seen it all before. Sarah had started recording the interaction on her phone. Mitchell's face turned almost purple when he noticed. That's it. I'm calling the police. You're trespassing in a private aviation facility. Just then, a familiar voice boomed across the terminal. What in God's name is going on here? Everyone turned to see Mr. William Richardson, the hospital board chairman, striding through the terminal doors. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 60s, dressed in an expensive suit. Sarah had just spoken with him the night before about the emergency case in Boston. Mitchell straightened his uniform, trying to look more professional. Sir, we're handling a security situation here. Security situation? Mr. Richardson's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Do you have any idea who you're detaining? This is Dr. Sarah Thompson, one of the finest neurosurgeons in the country. The crowd watched as Mitchell's confident demeanor began to crack. Sir, I was just following protocol. Protocol? Mr. Richardson walked over to stand beside Sarah. I specifically chartered this jet for Dr. Thompson. She's flying out to perform emergency surgery on a child, a surgery that should have started preparation an hour ago. Sarah checked her watch. It was now 7:15 a.m. The delay was affecting the entire surgical schedule. Mr. Richardson, I need to get to Boston as soon as possible. Jamie's surgery can't wait much longer. Mitchell's face had gone from red to pale. I didn't know. Clearly, you didn't know a lot of things. Mr. Richardson cut him off. You didn't know that Dr. Thompson is not only a surgeon but sits on our hospital's executive board. You didn't know that she's flown from this terminal dozens of times. And you certainly didn't know that I was arriving this morning to fly with her to Boston for a board meeting after her surgery. The crowd had grown larger, and several people were still recording. Mitchell looked around, suddenly realizing the gravity of his situation. His hands began to shake slightly as he tried to maintain his authority. I'll need to verify all of this with my supervisor, he said weakly. Oh, we'll be speaking with your supervisor, all right, Mr. Richardson replied. I'm the terminal manager and the company owner, who, by the way, is a personal friend of mine. He turned to the young guard, Tom. Please escort Dr. Thompson through security immediately. We've wasted enough time. As Tom quickly began processing her through security, Sarah could see Mitchell standing frozen, his world crumbling around him. She had won this battle, but the war against discrimination was far from over. The next few minutes would prove to be even more interesting as justice began to unfold. The terminal manager, Mrs. Linda Chen, arrived within minutes of being called. She was a sharp-looking woman in her 40s who took one look at the scene and knew exactly how serious the situation was. Security footage of the incident was already playing on her tablet as she walked briskly toward the group. Mr. Richardson, Dr. Thompson, I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for this incident, Mrs. Chen said, her voice filled with genuine concern. She shot a stern look at Mitchell, who was now standing off to the side, looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The crowd of onlookers had grown even larger. Among them, a man stepped forward. He was wearing a pilot's uniform with a light private aviation's logo. Mrs. Chen, if I may speak, I've flown Dr. Thompson several times before. She's one of our most respected regular passengers. Mitchell's face fell even further. Sarah could see beads of sweat forming on his forehead as more people came forward to support her. That's right, another voice called out. It was Janet, one of the regular flight attendants. Dr. Thompson flew with us just last month for another emergency surgery. She saved that patient's life. Mrs. Chen nodded, then turned to Mitchell. James Mitchell, how long have you worked at this terminal? 8 months, ma'am. He stuttered, his earlier arrogance completely gone. 8 months, she repeated, scrolling through something on her tablet. And I'm seeing multiple incident reports here. Complaints about excessive screening of certain passengers, reports of rude behavior, all showing a very disturbing pattern. Mr. Richardson checked his watch impatiently. While this needs to be addressed, Our priority right now is getting Dr. Thompson to Boston. That young patient can't wait any longer." Of course, Mrs. Chen agreed quickly. She turned to Tom, the young security guard. "Please finish processing Dr. Thompson and Mr. Richardson immediately." As Tom completed their security check, Sarah could hear Mrs. Chen speaking quietly but firmly to Mitchell. "Turn in your badge and security card. You're suspended pending a full investigation. We'll be reviewing all security footage from your shifts over the past 8 months." Mitchell's hands shook as he unpinned his badge. But I was just doing my job." "You can't." "Your job?" Mrs. Chen's voice was sharp. "Your job was to ensure passenger safety, not to discriminate and harass our clients. Do you understand the liability you've created for this company today?" Sarah gathered her belongings as she passed through security, now properly screened by Tom. The young guard kept apologizing quietly, clearly embarrassed by his colleague's behavior. "Dr. Thompson," Mrs. Chen called out before Sarah could head to the jet. "We'll need a statement from you when you return from Boston. Our legal team will be conducting a thorough investigation." Sarah nodded. "I'll provide everything you need. But right now, I have a teenage boy waiting for surgery." She turned to the crowd that had witnessed everything. "Thank you all for your support. Sometimes standing up to discrimination takes a village." As she and Mr. Richardson walked toward the jet, Sarah could hear Mitchell's desperate protests fading behind them. The pilot who had spoken up earlier was already heading to the cockpit to begin pre-flight checks, determined to make up for lost time. "I've already called Boston General," Mr. Richardson said as they climbed the stairs to the aircraft. "They're adjusting the surgery schedule. The OR team will be ready the moment we land." Inside the jet, Sarah finally allowed herself to relax slightly in the comfortable leather seat. The flight attendant, Janet, immediately brought her a cup of coffee and a sympathetic smile. "You handled that incredibly well," Mr. Richardson said, settling into his seat. "But I'm sorry you had to handle it at all." Sarah took a sip of her coffee, thinking about how this morning would change things. "Sometimes change only happens when someone stands their ground," she replied. "But this isn't over yet. We need to make sure this never happens to anyone else." As the jet's engine started up, Sarah could see Mitchell being escorted out of the terminal through her window. The man's shoulders were slumped in defeat, his security uniform now just a reminder of the power he had misused. But there was still more to come in this story of justice and consequences. The sleek private jet soared through the morning sky, making up for lost time. Dr. Sarah Thompson sat reviewing her patient's files on her tablet, but her mind kept drifting back to the incident at the terminal. Janet, the flight attendant, had just served fresh coffee when Mr. Richardson cleared his throat. "Sarah, there's something you should know about James Mitchell," he said, putting down his phone. "I've been making some calls. Turns out this isn't his first job in aviation security." Sarah looked up from her tablet, interest piqued. "What do you mean?" "He was fired from Capital Regional Airport last year," Mr. Richardson continued, his face grim. "They tried to keep it quiet, but 3 different passengers filed discrimination complaints against him in 6 months. The flight attendant, Janet, who was nearby, spoke up. "I hate to interrupt, but I think I should share something too." She sat down in a nearby seat. "2 weeks ago, I saw him give a hard time to Dr. Martinez, that Hispanic cardiac surgeon who flies with us. I reported it, but I guess nothing came of it." Sarah's hand tightened around her coffee cup. "So this has been a pattern." "A very clear one," Mr. Richardson nodded. "Mrs. Chen just texted me. They're reviewing security footage from the past 8 months. It's worse than we thought. Mitchell has been targeting minorities, especially successful women, consistently." The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "We're making good time, Dr. Thompson. We should land in Boston in about 30 minutes." Sarah checked her watch. They were indeed making up for lost time. But her mind was working on something bigger now. "Mr. Richardson, you know what this means, right? This isn't just about one racist guard. It's about a system that kept failing to stop him." "I agree," he replied, pulling out his laptop. "That's why I've been drafting something during our flight. Take a look at this." He turned the screen toward her. The document was titled Private Aviation Security Reform Initiative. Sarah leaned forward, reading quickly. "This is impressive," she said after a few minutes. mandatory bias training, quarterly reviews of security footage, anonymous reporting systems for staff and passengers. And here's the best part, Mr. Richardson clicked to the next page. We're proposing the joint oversight committee between the hospital board and Elite Aviation. Since we're their biggest client, they can't really refuse. Janet, who had been listening, smiled broadly. That would change everything. You know, there are other staff members who wanted to report things but were afraid to speak up. Well, they can speak up now, Sarah said firmly. Mitchell's actions today didn't just affect me. They affected a 16-year-old patient waiting for surgery. This is about public safety as much as it is about discrimination. Mr. Richardson's phone buzzed again. He read the message and let out a low whistle. Mrs. Chen just informed me that 3 other employees have already come forward with stories about Mitchell. And someone posted a video of this morning's incident online. It's getting attention. Sarah closed her patient's files and sat back in her seat. You know what surprises me? Mitchell never even bothered to check my history with the terminal. If he had just looked at the passenger logs. That's because people like him don't expect to be challenged, Janet said. They count on people staying quiet out of fear or hurry. The plane began its descent into Boston, the city skyline appearing through the windows. Sarah could see Boston General Hospital in the distance. Her patient was waiting there. Mr. Richardson, she said, gathering her things, I want to be part of that oversight committee. After I finish this surgery, we need to make sure this story becomes more than just a viral video. It needs to create real change. I was hoping you'd say that, he smiled. Mitchell thought he was ruining your day, but instead, he just helped launch a major reform in private aviation security. As the plane touched down in Boston, Sarah felt a new sense of purpose. Yes, she had a critical surgery ahead of her, but she also had a new mission. Mitchell's actions had backfired spectacularly. Instead of crushing one successful black woman, he had triggered a movement that would open doors for many others. Back at a light private aviation terminal, Mrs. Chen sat in her office, staring at her computer screen in disbelief. The video of Mitchell confronting Dr. Thompson had gone viral, with over 100,000 views in just a few hours. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since morning. Yes, Mr. Peterson, she spoke into her phone to the company CEO. We've already suspended Mitchell and started a full investigation. She paused, listening. Yes, sir, we're pulling all security footage from his shifts. On her second monitor, emails were pouring in. Some were from other passengers sharing their own experiences with Mitchell. Others were from news organizations requesting statements. But the most concerning ones were from their biggest clients, demanding to know how this could have happened. Tom, the young security guard who had tried to help Dr. Thompson, knocked on her office door. Mrs. Chen, you wanted to see the incident reports I filed. Yes, come in, Tom. She gestured to a chair. And bring those reports from your locker. Tom sat down, placing a folder on her desk. I should have pushed harder when I saw things happening. Mitchell always said I was too soft, that I didn't understand security protocols. Mrs. Chen opened the folder, reading through Tom's carefully documented reports. Each one detailed instances of Mitchell's discriminatory behavior, excessive questioning of minority passengers, rude comments, unnecessary delays, all marked pending review by the previous security supervisor. Why didn't these reports go anywhere, she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Tom shifted uncomfortably. The old supervisor, Mr. Roberts, he and Mitchell were friends. He usually just filed them away, said Mitchell was being thorough in his job. Mrs. Chen's phone buzzed again, another message from the CEO. She read it and let out a heavy sigh. Well, Mr. Roberts will have some explaining to do as well. We're reviewing everyone who enabled this behavior. Meanwhile, in the terminal's security office, 2 IT specialists were going through months of security camera footage. What they found was damning. Mitchell had a clear pattern of targeting successful minorities, especially women. The footage showed him waving through white passengers while subjecting others to excessive scrutiny. Look at this one IT specialist said to the other, pointing at his screen. 3 weeks ago, he made a black business executive wait 45 minutes for random screening while letting everyone else through. The evidence was overwhelming. Mitchell's personnel file from his previous job had arrived, revealing he'd been fired for similar behavior. However, due to a non-disclosure agreement, The previous airport hadn't disclosed the real reason for his termination when Elite Aviation checked his references. In the employee break room, Janet was sharing her experiences with other staff members. "I saw him do this so many times," she said, stirring her coffee. "He always had an excuse, security protocols or random screening, but it was never random." The door opened and Mrs. Chen walked in. The room fell silent. "Please, continue talking," she said. "In fact, I want everyone to speak up now. We're having a mandatory staff meeting in an hour. Everything comes out today." Her phone buzzed yet again. This time it was a message from Mr. Richardson. "Dr. Thompson's surgery was successful. The patient will make a full recovery. When she returns, we need to talk about implementing new security oversight measures." Mrs. Chen smiled slightly. At least something good had come from this day. She looked around the break room at her staff, seeing the mix of guilt, relief, and determination on their faces. "You know," she said, addressing everyone present, "Mitchell thought he had power because he wore a security badge. But real power comes from using your position to protect people, not harass them. Today, we start fixing this. Everyone will be heard." As she walked back to her office, she passed Mitchell's empty security station. His badge and uniform had been collected, his access cards deactivated. But the real work was just beginning. Changing a culture of discrimination would take more than firing one racist guard. It would require systemic changes, new policies, and most importantly, people brave enough to speak up. The terminal might never be the same after today, and that was exactly what needed to happen. 1 week after the incident, the main conference room at Elite Private Aviation was packed. Dr. Sarah Thompson sat at the head of the table beside Mr. Richardson and Mrs. Chen. Representatives from other major airports, aviation companies, and hospital networks filled the seats. The story had grown much bigger than one racist guard at one private terminal. "The changes we're proposing today will affect all private aviation facilities in our network," Mrs. Chen explained, standing before a large screen displaying their new security protocols. "What happened to Dr. Thompson revealed problems we can't ignore anymore." Sarah watched the faces around the table. Some looked uncomfortable, others determined. The video of her confrontation with Mitchell had reached millions of views online, sparking a national conversation about discrimination in private aviation. First, Mrs. Chen continued, "We're implementing mandatory body camera requirements for all security personnel. Every interaction will be recorded and reviewed regularly." A man from another aviation company raised his hand. "That's going to be expensive." "Not as expensive as discrimination lawsuits," Mr. Richardson replied firmly. "Since the incident, 23 other passengers have come forward with complaints about similar treatment at various terminals." Sarah stood up, smoothing her dress. "If I may," she walked to the front of the room. "Last week, I almost couldn't perform emergency surgery on a 16-year-old boy because one man decided I didn't look like I belonged in a private terminal. That boy could have died." The room fell silent. Sarah clicked to the next slide, showing a new reporting system interface. "This is what we're proposing, a real-time reporting app that any passenger or employee can use to report discrimination. No more buried complaints. No more ignored incident reports." Tom, who had been promoted to head of security training, spoke up from his seat. "We've already started implementing new training programs. Every security officer will undergo monthly bias awareness sessions. And we're setting up anonymous tip lines for staff to report concerns." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "And speaking of staff, we've made significant changes there too. Mitchell wasn't the only one fired. 3 supervisors who ignored complaints have been terminated, and we're rebuilding our security team from the ground up." The meeting continued for 2 hours. By the end, 17 private aviation companies had signed on to the new protocols. It was an unprecedented cooperation in the industry. After the meeting, Janet approached Sarah in the hallway. "Dr. Thompson, you should see the changes already happening here. Yesterday, an Indian CEO came through, and our new security team was so professional. He actually commented on how different it felt." Sarah smiled. "That's good to hear, but we can't get comfortable. Change takes constant effort." Mr. Richardson joined them, holding his tablet. "Speaking of change, you might want to see this." He showed them a news article. The headline read, Former aviation security guard charged with civil rights violations. Mitchell? Janet asked, peering at the screen. Yes, Mr. Richardson confirmed. After our investigation revealed his pattern of discrimination, the authorities got involved. Turns out he had incidents at 3 other airports before coming here. He just kept moving around, doing the same thing at different places. Sarah read the article carefully. Mitchell was facing serious charges, and his case had prompted investigations at other airports too. His attempt to block one black woman from boarding a private jet had accidentally exposed systemic problems throughout the industry. Dr. Thompson, Mrs. Chen called from down the hall. Channel 5 News is here. They want to interview you about the new changes in aviation security. Would you be willing to speak with them? Sarah thought about it for a moment. Yes, she decided. People need to see that speaking up can lead to real change. As she walked toward the waiting news crew, Sarah remembered Mitchell's smirking face from that morning a week ago. He had thought he was ruining her day. Instead, he had given her a platform to create lasting change. His racism had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. The news reporter smiled as Sarah approached. Dr. Thompson, how does it feel to know your stand against discrimination is changing the entire private aviation industry? Sarah straightened her shoulders and smiled back. This was just the beginning. 6 months after the incident, Dr. Sarah Thompson stood at a podium in the main hall of Alight Private Aviation. The terminal had been transformed, not just in policies but in atmosphere. Behind her, a large banner read Aviation Equality Initiative, 1-year launch. When I walked through these doors half a year ago, Sarah began, addressing the packed room, I was just trying to get to a patient who needed surgery. I never expected to start a movement. The audience included aviation executives, medical professionals, and even some politicians. In the front row sat Jamie Chen, the teenage patient whose surgery she had performed that eventful day, now fully recovered and smiling with his parents. But today, we're celebrating more than just new security protocols, Sarah continued. We're celebrating real change. In the past 6 months, reported incidents of discrimination at private aviation facilities have dropped by 87%. Mrs. Chen, now promoted to Regional Director of Operations, stood up to share the latest statistics. Our new reporting system has been adopted by 42 private aviation terminals across the country. We processed over 500 incident reports, leading to 34 terminations and countless improvements in our security procedures. Tom, who had become the head of the new security training division, stepped up next. Every security officer now undergoes monthly training. We've hired a more diverse security team, and our body camera program has become a model for other airports. From his seat in the audience, Mr. Richardson nodded proudly. The hospital board had expanded its partnership with Elite Aviation, creating a special program to facilitate emergency medical flights with enhanced security protocols. Janet, now the Chief of Staff Relations, shared her own update. Employee reporting of discrimination has increased by 200%, not because there are more incidents, but because people finally feel safe speaking up. The audience applauded as Sarah returned to the podium. And what about James Mitchell, the guard who started all this by trying to stop me that morning? Well, his story has become a teaching case in our training programs. On the screen behind her, news headlines appeared. Former security guard pleads guilty to civil rights violations. Mitchell sentenced. Judge cites pattern of discrimination. Aviation industry implements Thompson Protocol for security screening. Mitchell thought he was protecting this terminal from people who didn't belong, Sarah continued. Instead, he showed us exactly what didn't belong in aviation: discrimination, bias, and unchecked power. Jamie Chen raised his hand from the front row. Dr. Thompson, can I say something? Sarah smiled and nodded, gesturing him to the podium. The teenager stood straight and addressed the crowd. If Dr. Thompson hadn't stood up to that guard that day, I might not be here, he said simply. She didn't just save my life in surgery. She made sure other doctors won't be stopped from saving lives too. The room erupted in applause. Sarah wiped a tear from her eye as she hugged Jamie. His words had captured exactly what this was all about, ensuring that discrimination never again prevented someone from receiving the help they needed. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah walked through the terminal with Mr. Richardson. The security checkpoint where everything had happened now had new officers, new equipment, and a large sign reading "Equal treatment under equal rules." "You know what the best part is?" Mr. Richardson said, stopping by the window where private jets stood gleaming in the sun. "Mitchell's actions that day didn't just change this terminal. The Thompson Protocol is being adopted by commercial airports too. Your stand here is helping people everywhere." Sarah watched as a diverse group of passengers passed through security, each treated with the same respect and professionalism. The young security officer manning the checkpoint, a woman in a hijab, smiled warmly at each person. "Sometimes," Sarah said, picking up her medical bag, "the biggest changes start with one person saying enough. Mitchell tried to crush my spirit that day. Instead, he sparked a revolution." As she walked toward her waiting flight, Sarah remembered Mitchell's words. "This is a private aviation terminal, not some public bus station. We have standards here." He had been right about one thing. They did have standards now, real ones. Standards of equality, respect, and justice. And those standards were changing aviation, one flight at a time.